How's it going, everyone, and welcome into another episode of ADP Battles here on the SFS channel, where every single week I take two players being drafted at relatively the same position, I stack them up against one another, and I make the decision which is the more worthwhile investment in the early rounds of our fantasy football leagues this season. Today's video is coming out a bit later than usual as I went to the NBA Finals on Sunday, and basically I lost my voice from screaming, yelling, and cheering for my Bucks, so I had to wait a bit longer to record this to let my vocal cords heal up a little bit, so bear with me through today's episode. But I've got a little bit of a surprise for you in today's video with some new formatting and a new look for the channel today. So let me know in the comment section down below if you like the look and if you think we should stick with it going forward. But it's Alvin Kamara versus Derrick Henry in today's video. The RB1 and RB2 finishers from the 2020 season. So two absolutely star-studded players that we really want to get our hands on this fantasy season. So without further ado, if you haven't done so already, head down, give this video a like, and subscribe to the channel. Let's hit the intro and get in to Kamara versus Henry and which player we should have higher on our draft boards in the 2021 fantasy season. Alrighty, here we are with the new look SFS today with the new overlay, the new style, whatever it is you want to call it. We've got ourselves a new look here in today's video. I'm looking to stick with this throughout the remainder of the season, and I've got myself a altered screen of this same stylistic idea for our mock drafts that we'll be doing here on the channel. But overall, I think it's a cleaner look and I like it. But nonetheless, today we're going to be diving into everything from situational analysis, talent, play style, and just breaking down and doing a deep dive into these two players so that, again, we can decide which of them is the more worthwhile investment for our 2021 fantasy football leagues. The first thing I want to say is these two players, although their production is virtually at the top of the running back class each and every single year, they are entirely two different players, and their play styles could not be more different from one another. You've got your bulldozer, your dump truck, Derrick Henry, who is an absolute volume machine. There's not another running back in the National Football League that touches the ball and has it in his hands more than Derrick Henry does, but there's also not a player that's as efficient and as better of a receiving option than Alvin Kamara, whereas your Derrick Henry is not the player getting that receiving work and isn't a player being utilized in the passing game of his respective offense. So a lot of differences, but a lot of similarities in the production category. We're going to be talking about how each of these players end up achieving that value and how I see that translating and projecting into the future here for these two players. So as I touched on for a brief second there, Alvin Kamara, we'll talk about him first in today's video, is one of the most efficient running backs in the National Football League, especially for a fantasy player of his caliber. Alvin Kamara only averages 18 touches per game as opposed to your other premier running backs in fantasy like your McCaffreys, your Cooks, your Derrick Henrys of the world, getting between 23 and 25 touches on a per game basis. So between 5 and 7 less touches on a per game basis is a pretty significant marker to be at, but it just shows you the work that Alvin Kamara does to better himself in other phases of the game where he doesn't need quite as much volume as those other players to put up numbers that are similar to, or in the case of last season, better than the rest of the pack, obviously finishing as the RB1. So 6.25 yards per touch, that's rushing and receiving numbers put together for Alvin Kamara based off of his scrimmage yardage and touch total from last season. He only had 270 total touches last year. That's 127 less than Derrick Henry received with his 397 total opportunities. Again, a lot less volume for Kamara. That's how we get that 5 to 7 fewer touches per game. And that's a lot. That's a big difference. But Kamara makes up for it. And the main staple of how he gets his fantasy football production is that ultra vital receiving game in the work that he does out of the backfield as a pass catcher. More so, and significantly more so, I would argue, than the work he does as a rushing threat. And you'll see that I'll talk about his numbers in this video. His rushing numbers aren't all that great, but it's what he does as a pass catcher that really sets him apart from the group and is how he gets that efficiency number, because we know that from statistical research and analytical data for fantasy football, a target is worth twice as many, or roughly twice as many fantasy football points as a rushing attempt is in the NFL. So you're getting more yardage, you're getting more bang for your buck when you get those targets out of the backfield. You're able to find more space, not find contact quite as quickly, and you're just able to get out in the open field and have the opportunity for an explosive play much quicker. That's why we see wide receivers going 6 for 100 as opposed to running backs almost never go 6 carries for 100 yards. It's more like 15 to 20 carries for 100 yards is considered a great game. So all in all here, Alvin Kamara, from a career and in a holistic body of work perspective, has been an absolute demon in the pass catching game the entirety of his NFL career. He's played 4 straight seasons of having 80 or more receptions in the NFL, and every year he's been in the league, he has had 97 or more targets, with 3 out of his 4 years having over 100 targets. So literally putting up wide receiver numbers. That's like high-end wide receiver 2 target category for a player who is being utilized as his team's lead back out of the backfield. So again, incredibly impressive. He had 83 receptions in this past 2021 season, which was the high of his career. But something I think is even more interesting is that Alvin Kamara has never had more than 200 rushing attempts in a given year. Again, that just shows you we are doing the damage through the air here. And what I think is an underrated part of this is that it's keeping him cleaner and reducing the wear and tear on his body that he has going forward. When he's catching passes out of the backfield, if you've ever watched Kamara play, he is getting the ball, running to the sideline, and scampering out of bounds before he can take a big hit, before he gets decked. I mean, obviously, he's still getting tackled at times, but as opposed to a Derrick Henry who has a physical play style and is in the mix of every single play and getting tackled and ends up on the ground virtually every time, obviously, with the exception of when he scores the frequent touchdown, Kamara's getting out of bounds, staying clean, staying healthy, more importantly, and being more efficient with those numbers because he was able to find that space in the first place to get out of bounds. So one more time, never has had a 200-yard touch season on the ground or 1,000 yards rushing. So that really kind of sells us home here that Alvin Kamara gets his value in fantasy football as a receiving back. And the main thing, and I think a lot of us are worried about for this year, is whether or not he's going to be able to turn over that production and have the same level of output without Drew Brees in his 2021 situation, which is clearly a huge thing to deal with here. So Brees obviously lost to retirement for this season for the Saints, and now we've got ourselves some quarterback controversy, some drama, and I don't know if I'd go as far as say drama, but it is definitely going to be a switch for the first time in a very long time for this franchise. And for a player like Kamara, who's had such a cerebral and great decision-making quarterback at the helm, to give him those check-down bailout options, find him in space, and when the play breaks down, get Kamara some really good looks, that's going to be something that's a bit different in this offense this year. And that's going to be something that is going to have to be overcome. Personally, I'm not really sure whether or not Jameis Winston or Taysom Hill gives us the better situation from a fantasy perspective. I have my opinions. I would argue that Jameis Winston is the better alternative of the two for Kamara, because when we saw Taysom Hill come into this offense last season, his targets per game dropped significantly, and the amount of looks he was getting out of the backfield were much fewer than it was when Drew Brees was the starting quarterback for this team. So regardless, I think that either Sean Payton is going to have to help this quarterback tandem learn and understand that they need to take advantage and utilize Kamara out of the backfield more than they were doing last season, or we are just simply going to see lost production value here, and maybe Kamara drops below 80 targets for the first time in any given season. But I also wouldn't bet on it too highly, because Sean Payton's already come out, said he wants to lean more heavily on the running back tandem in Alvin Kamara and Latavius Murray. Obviously, Mark Ingram's been out of town for a couple years now. Murray is now the more traditional style running back in this backfield. He said it point blank. They're going to need to take advantage of these players who are very talented and have been very productive players in their own right over the entirety in the course of their careers. I mean, Latavius Murray has had really good stints for the Vikings and Raiders previous to his time with now the Saints. But they're not only going to have to, and I would not be shocked whatsoever if we see an Alvin Kamara become one of those 200-plus touch per game players on the ground. And maybe if he can even tack on those 80-plus receptions as well, get on another 100-target season, it's going to wear down his shelf life and his ability to produce long-term and from a dynasty perspective. But in terms of the 2020 season, or 2021 season rather, I wouldn't be worried at all with Alvin Kamara's value, because when he does get those targets out of the backfield, he is still going to be incredibly productive with them. Sean Payton's no fool. He knows that that's the strength of this game. That's the strength of this offense outside of Michael Thomas. And I would argue Alvin Kamara is still better as an offensive threat than Thomas is. This is their best player, and they need to get the ball in his hands. So they are not going to make any excuses to do so. They're just going to draw up plays for him, and they're going to get him out in space and doing what he does so well. But one thing I want to touch on with Kamara here before we shift gears, more so looking towards Derrick Henry and why I either think he is or isn't a better option than Kamara here for this fantasy season, we got to talk about where I see regression coming from him. And that obviously, and I think in general, and I just want to put this out there while I'm on the topic, I think both of these players have already reached their fantasy ceiling, and they have already peaked in their performances from the 2021 season. You talk about an Alvin Kamara finishing as the RB1, again, 30 touches under 300, which is a very, very unusual marker that we see a running back get to with such high production on such limited touches. And then you look at a Derrick Henry who literally had 2,141 scrimmage yards last season on nearly 400 touches. How do you get better from that is my question. Like, we have seen few players in NFL history have 400 touch seasons. Henry was 3 away last year, and the touchdowns were great. The explosive plays were great. He led the National Football League with 16 of them. I should probably wait a second here before I get into these numbers, but I essentially think both of these players have been on the upward trend for years and years and years now, and I just can't imagine them getting any better. So while I still think they're must-own players for fantasy this season, while I still think they're great options to have in our lineups, I'm not necessarily so sure that we should be projecting them to outscore and outproduce the value and the upside they gave us last season. So closing thoughts here on Alvin Kamara. The touchdowns are going to be a major point of regression for him this year. Let's just talk about simply an Aaron Jones in 2019 who had 22 total touchdowns. He chopped that number in half moving into the 2020 season with only 11 total touchdowns. Alvin Kamara had 21 of those touchdowns. I wouldn't be shocked at all. And I think that we could all be really happy as a fantasy community if we saw him get 14 or 15 and even reduce that count by 6. But the more likely side of things here is that the number drops off more than that. And maybe he doesn't. And again, while I did talk about they want to utilize these backs more, give them more touches, the efficiency is going to come down for Kamara if he's ending up seeing more work on the ground and less work through the air, even if he still has 270 touches. If he only goes down to 60 receptions and 240, my math is brutal right now. If he goes down to and cracks that 210 marker on the ground and only sees 60 receptions and gets him right to that 270 marker, you're still looking at a reduced efficiency because he's not getting out in space as much as I talked about earlier with those receiving opportunities and the ability to get out and have less defenders and less traffic in the area that he's doing his work. So if that touchdown number comes down to, you're still looking at regression for Kamara here in a season where I think that we're going to be very fortunate to see him get into even the mid to low teens for the touchdown category just because he did so much in that area last season. And when you talk about having an extreme outlier performance, 6 total touchdowns against the Minnesota Vikings, week 16 last year, that is an anomaly. That will never happen again in Alvin Kamara's career. He will never have another 6 rushing touchdown game. I forget if he had one through the air or if it was all on the ground, but nonetheless, that's incredibly unreliable, and the touchdown department in general is one that you tend to look at and not want to bank too highly upon production from year to year. There's only a handful of players that I would say have such an established role in their game that the production in the touchdown department is so consistent on a year-to-year basis. It's something to count on, but Kamara's not one of those players. He's not a bruiser on the goal line like Derrick Henry. He does command a lot of the work share on that area of the field for the Saints offense, but there's still a lot of things I don't like about that here. So I'm expecting regression once again for both of these players. But now let's talk about Derrick Henry in his fantasy situation, as well as recapping his year last season very briefly. King Henry has flat out been a monster every single year since he's come to the league. Obviously, DeMarco Murray at the very early stages of his career was the starter for the Titans offense. Derrick wasn't exactly the workhorse back that we see now, but he has improved in every major statistical category for the running back position every single year he's been a starter, and not only a starter, but in the league. So his production has literally steamrolled and just added on top of itself every year he has not regressed in one major marker. He's increased his touchdowns, his touches, his total rushing yards. It's actually quite insane. When NFL posted the graphic about it, I was shocked that he literally has gotten better at everything every single year. And I hate to be the skeptic here. I hate to be the guy that, calls for a stoppage in that improvement, because I think Derrick's one of the best players in the league, one of the most entertaining, and certainly the most valuable player in his offense, especially being the centerpiece and basically what that whole system is founded upon. But I just don't see how it can get any better. There's only been a few players in NFL history to have over 2,000 rushing yards in one singular season. I don't know how you go back to back here. I don't know how you can match that performance. I talked about how few players have ever reached the 400 total touch marker in a given season. And again, Henry fell 3 short of that marker in 2020. But nearly none of those players came back the same guy the next year. The amount of wear and tear that has on your body, the amount of abuse and physical just damage your body takes from being tackled almost 400 times in a year is tremendous. And I don't think that we can state that lightly. And of course, there's the argument that Derrick Henry is a freak of nature, a one-of-one type player. We've never seen anything quite like it. A player of this size, this height, this speed, the physical ability to just impose his will on a given defender. I get all that, and I understand that he's an absolutely unpredictable, and we haven't again seen anything quite like this. So he's an outlier and a player that doesn't necessarily fit the mold of the rest of the fantasy players that we've seen in the past here. But it's something that when there's historical data that shows us these players are showing major statistical withdrawal and major efficiency withdrawal just because their bodies can't take it anymore, I think it is something to be said here. And I will acknowledge the fact that I do think Derrick Henry is unlike any other player, and maybe his durability is greater than a lot of previous running backs. So I will still say that I don't expect him to just fall off a cliff this season by any means. But I do think that it would at least be reasonable to see him fall back to 1,700, 1,600 yards rushing. He had 17 total touchdowns last season, so I also don't think it would be crazy to see him go down to maybe 14 or so. And still, this is a player with limited involvement in the receiving game. Additionally, Tennessee, and while it's my personal belief that they will continue to center this offense and have Derrick Henry be the core of the team, I at least have to acknowledge and bring up the point to you guys that Julio Jones is now on this team. The Titans now have 2 number 1 wide receivers instead of just 1. So the ability is there to pass the ball downfield more, and while they're still going to be setting up those deep balls from play action games set up by efficient running by Derrick Henry, they're still going to be throwing the ball down the field, getting explosive plays. I would argue ending drives sooner. So I just think overall we are going to see for the first time in his career statistical regression instead of, improvement in progression from Henry. So all in all, the player that I think that we should be taking first in our fantasy drafts by the slimmest of margins, and these are RBs 3 and 4 right now in fantasy, with Saquon Barkley right behind them at the RB5 position. My rankings on sizzlefantasy.com and the SFS 2021 draft guide are just a bit different, but the player I think we should be taking first and prior of these two is Alvin Kamara, simply for the fact that he's the more efficient player. He has the lighter touch load on his body throughout the entirety of his NFL career, and especially just showing us and knowing how he gets that production, I feel more comfortable projecting it on a year-to-year basis, and I think the floor is a bit safer, especially because, again, we don't exactly know who Derrick Henry is going to be walking into camp day one, and I know it seems so easy and on paper obvious to just say he's going to come back and do it again, but it's truly something unprecedented that we haven't seen in the past of the entire history of the National Football League. So what he's doing right now is all-time great historical production from the running back position, but there has to be a time, there's an inevitable point where Father Time wins, and I'm not saying that Derrick Henry is like this old washed-up running back, but he's going into, I think, year 6 now. There is a point in time when you've reached your ceiling, you've reached your peak. We talked about running back shelf lives, and is 30 the magic number for just falling off a cliff at the position? That's kind of all been relatively debunked, and it's situational. It's not like a proven thing that it happens every time. And Derrick Henry's not 30 years old, just to, touch on that for a second. But he has been doing volume that we haven't seen over, now it's like 3 or 4 years, that is just unheard of. So I'm not expecting him to fall off a cliff. One more time, I just want to make that clear. But I do think it is realistic for us to expect him. And again, both of these players will regress, in my opinion, for the 2021 season. If he even draws back to 1,800 yards, that's still 300 yards less of production that you're getting. And again, for a player not involved in that receiving game, he has about a yard less per touch in efficiency than Alvin Kamara did last season. So just some things to take into consideration here. Both of these guys had ridiculously high touchdown counts. Again, 21 for Kamara, 17 for Derrick Henry. Those are outliers. Those are anomalies. And those are, or these are players, rather, that have that element present in their games. But regardless of who you are, that's still an incredibly high touchdown marker. Devontae Adams in the wide receiver category is a player who is, I think he's got like 12 or 13 more touchdowns over the last 5 years than any other player in the league, but he had 18 last year. Like, you just can't project that year over year. I think we'd be happy if Adams scored 12 this season, especially if we don't know if Aaron Rodgers is going to be on the field. So there's just realism here that we have to take into consideration. There is a number of factors that play into this decision, but for me, the efficiency of Alvin Kamara and that Saints offense, the light workload he's had, and the ability for him, I think, to expand upon the touches that he's seen, not necessarily his efficiency and his overall production output, but the raw volume and the raw number of looks he gets on a per-game basis. I would not be shocked if we look at him next year and he finishes between 20 and 21, even if it's just 3 touches per game. That can be relatively significant for his fantasy value this season. So Kamara over Henry, I've got them ranked right next to each other in the SFS Draft Guide rankings for the 2021 season. And if you want to check that out, obviously the link is in the description of this video. You can, obviously it's on your screen, so you can type it into the search bar of your open browser, or however you want to go about doing that. That's today's video. Alrighty, that was Alvin Kamara versus Derrick Henry for the 2021 fantasy football season. Again, this choice was incredibly tough. It came down to just a few minor details that swung the pendulum one way or the other. And while, again, I did project regression for both of these players this season, I still think they're must-owns. They're going to finish as top 5 backs as long as they stay healthy this season. And even with some minor statistical withdrawal, they're still going to be very prevalent forces in your lineups and still very, very productive players that we can lean on game in and game out. So you want both of these guys on your teams. But if the opportunity presents itself where they're both there, this is my opinion. This is how I'm feeling at this moment in time based on the information we have from last season going forward into this year now. So thank you all so much for watching. Make sure to turn that bell on and subscribe if you're new around here so you never miss an episode. Stay tuned for tomorrow's video, and I'll see you then. Peace out.